Welcome, everyone. I am very excited about our guest speakers today, but to frame why we have someone speaking about Alexander von Humboldt and about color catalogs, I'm going to introduce some of my own work and why I think sensors are so important. And so that's the story of today's talk of sensor sleuths. So somehow I cajoled you all to come because of mud. And my first mud painting was actually done right outside of Mann Library in 2004. And it was from the BB Lake over here, right? If the trees weren't there, you could see them. And it's the swimming hole, or it used to be the swimming hole. And the piece was called Winogradsky Rothko, named after a scientist and an artist, as I was trying to figure out how I could be a scientist and an artist. So Rothko is an abstract expressionist painter, and Sergei Winogradsky was a 19th century microbiologist from Russia. And this is what a traditional Winogradsky column looks like. Second graders do this in their science class, or sixth graders or 12th graders, everybody does it. He did this in the late 1800s, soon after the microscope had been invented. And he thought soil was alive. And so what he did, but we didn't understand what soil was. So he put a column of soil in his window in a clear container and looked at it every day when he sat at his desk. And eventually a little red splooge shows up. So he puts his pipette down into the little red splooge, he pulls it up, he puts it on his new microscope slide, which I'm sure felt really great because it's another sensor. And he saw soil particles, and then he saw squiggly things, right? Microbes. And he evolved a whole cycle of life concept, and he is considered a forethinker in all of soil bioecology. My point here is that microbes make pigment, and pigment is an indicator, right? He found them because they turned red. He selected from that red area. He put it underneath a microscope and he saw it. So this is what happens in a Winogradsky column, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically you have a high oxygen gradient at the top and a high sulfur gradient at the bottom. So that means there's this change as you go down the column: high oxygen, no sulfur, some oxygen, some sulfur, lots of sulfur and no oxygen. Those are three distinct ecosystems that select for different species. And as you can see, there's different colors and different relationships happening as you go up and down the column. And again, what I'm trying to say is that these bands of color are an indicator of these different ecosystems. My first Rothko I saw in the 4th grade. After I did my first first Winogradsky column, I thought, why don't I make a Rothko mud painting? So I chose this 1949 Untitled, and it was hanging by airline cable because it was like a ton, literally, from Emerson Hall. This is what it looked like over the time course. And I should let you know that I designed it to be a piece of anti-capitalist art. Why, you ask? Because the only way you could own it is if you watched it, because it is predicated on change. And so you can see these polka dots, which until this, I'd never thought about a polka dot as being a contested space. Like, what is the green in the center doing to the yellow on the outside? Is it a complementary or an antagonistic relationship? This was a dead earthworm that got split and it turned fluorescent orange. And this on the far left was this gorgeous, it had silvers and purples, and it was all this beautiful pointillism. And I was like, oh, it's so beautiful. And then I had snails that were mating and they reproduced and they ate it all up. And I was like, And then I had worms and they pooped it out. My point here is we have all kinds of sensors to catch change. We have eyes, we make tools, we conceive concepts and hypothesize. We develop methods of investigation and we communicate. My utopia, for futurities uncertain, is based on a reflexive cognition. What can we do or do differently if we pay attention to meaningful patterns? I'm going to start the next section talking about different other kinds of sensors. The Hudson River School of Art was from the mid-1800s. There were European American men, there were European American women, and there were a few European a few African-American men that all contributed to this body of work. And they discuss things like the grandeur and beauty of nature in their art, the fear of nature, the scariness of nature. You can see in the foreground, two redcoats, right? Look at how tiny those humans are in that gigantic landscape. Why are the redcoats here? Because there are natural resources, things to fight for. Here's someone prospecting. On the left, it's tempestuous, and on the right, it's starting to look like contemporary agriculture. The scale is changing, and it feels like something you can walk through. And here you have this sort of bucolic natural scene where it's becoming civilized. And here you can see just daily life. But here you can see trains and tree stumps, right? As the system is beginning to change. Now, notably, this is in the 1860s, that last image, 1860s, remember that. So the Hudson River School of Art reflected three themes of, I think, only, or I will just say Euro-American relations to the land in the 19th century, of discovery, exploration, and settlement. Moving from, yes, moving from diabolical fear of nature, heavenly admiration of nature, coexistence with nature, utility of nature, and the mastery of nature. So now we come to our time. In the context of climate change, what is changing and what are we choosing to sustain? Because this is really our question that we need to be asking ourselves. It's the same land. Which variables have changed? I would say we have changed. Those images that I just showed you are from the 1800s when we had 1 billion people. My parents were born in the 30s when there were 2 billion people. I was born in 1973 when there were 4 billion people, and now we're almost at 8 billion people. Plus we have huge amounts of energy consumption because we take notes, another form of sensing and collecting data. This is sensors that look at the carbon dioxide amounts in the atmosphere, and I could go on, but we have short time. And this is the temperature changing over time. My point here is that graphs, to me, are the contemporary landscape paintings of our time, which is another kind of way of sensing and communicating a visual language for reflexive understanding. So again, there's so much change just in my mud paintings as in our collective ecosystem, and change is upon us. So today's talk is all about tools and how we can celebrate these tools. The piece that was commissioned for the Cornell Biennial was based on these two paintings on the left by Rizi Tamachika from the 1800s, a Japan landscape artist. And on the right are the two paintings that I made. The one on the far right is more mud from BB Lake, and on the left, it's the same mud, but amended with 5% biochar, which is a climate change mitigating practice being studied by Johannes Lehmann in the Soil and Crop and Sciences Department, Soil and Crop Sciences Department. And then you'll see all of the stuff at the top, which is all of the wiring for the sensors that are inside of it. And those sensors measure pH, EH, and temperature. And I have tons of data. And if there's anybody who's a chemist out there who can help me understand all of this data, it would be really great, because it really is an art project in this case, because I am overwhelmed. Another piece that you'll see upstairs is called the Mansell Richter. It's currently still in India where I made it. It has 10 soil samples from the Lakes region and Bangalore, India. But it's based on Albert Mansell, a color theorist, and Gerhard Richter, a color artist. And what's interesting to me in that case is that Mansell's color theory was picked up by the USDA in the 1930s to build out these soil charts in order to be able to evaluate soil and categorize soils. And so this again was an artist influencing science and color acting as indicator. And so this is that piece that's in India currently. I haven't been back since COVID. This is a piece I did in the basement of Dan Biting, a graduate from Cornell. runs the Host Microbe Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. And we wanted to figure out who these paintings were in 2017. And so we used 21st century tools of detection and did RNA analysis. So I made a special frame, we removed the frame, and then we swabbed in the different colors. Found over 800 species in the 29 viable samples that we took. And in each color, right? Like I'm only picking the green, and then I'm picking just the orange, and then I'm picking just the red. There were between 30 and 100 species in each one of those colors. So my sense of color is ridiculous, right? It takes a community to make that color. It is not one species just making a color, it's a group, it's a composite. Not unlike Seurat, right? And here's where I just want to shift really quickly, right? This is pointillism in art, where you have all these little bits of dots. And that's exactly how my paintings are made. The individual bacteria make a pigmented color, they reproduce and they grow their dot, right? And then they colonize the landscape. Well, I want to bring us to the idea of extrapolation as a tool and the community that makes an ideal palpable. So this summer, I had the opportunity of meeting Nancy Kang. She works at NASA, and she studies the interaction between the biosphere and the atmosphere, focusing on life on land, and then extrapolates this thinking on our Earth to adding up the potency of other stars far away, the colors of the planets that surround those stars, and the plausibility for photosynthetic life there. So in other words, thinking of color of planets as a signature for life. And if you look at our own Earth, on the top, you can see it's in the middle of the summer and the northern hemisphere is green. And on the bottom, the northern hemisphere turns white. And this change, right, this sort of blinking of our planet on a 6-month cycle is a way that someone far away could detect life here, and likewise how we could detect life elsewhere. So my point here is these little microbes and their little photosynthetic pigments here on Earth are a lively window into exploring the potential of life elsewhere. So in summary, data are only as good as our ability to meaningfully collect and process it. Theories are only as good as our inclusive dialogue to vet them. Color is so cool. Microbes are an incredible model system, and life changes the world. So let's be smart in the ways that we ask it to change. So futurity is uncertain? Yes. Perhaps we can make sensible and equitable decisions going forward. So I would like to welcome our next two guests, Eleanor and Dan, and I'm going to read both of their bios so that we can speed through their talks. 5:16, I did it, almost. Okay, Eleanor Harvey is going to speak on the instruments of Humboldt's Unity of Nature. She earned a PhD in the history of art from Yale University and specializes in the relationship between landscape painting and cultural identification with nature. Most recently, she is the author of Alexander von Humboldt in the United States. This beautiful book, which accompanied an exhibit with the same name at the Smithsonian in 2020 and 2021. Dan Lewis is going to speak on The Shades of Things, a history of color dictionaries and descriptive charts in the 19th and 20th centuries. Dr. Dan Lewis is the Dibner Senior Curator for History of Science and Technology at the Huntington Library, Art Museum and Botanical Gardens in Southern California. His Permanent History of Science exhibit, Beautiful Science, Ideas That Change the World, which opened in 2008, was named by the American Alliance of Museums as the best exhibit in America, science and art. It's having a revitalization sometime soon, so keep his name in your books. Eleanor, will you please take over the screen and take it away from me?
I will happily do that, yes. First of all, thank you very much for asking me to be a part of all of this. And in the interest of full disclosure, Jenny and I met when she did an exhibition at Sandbox, which was the intersection of art and the environment at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. I was completely captivated watching those microbial colonies shift and change. She did time-lapse photography so that literally you felt like you were watching civilizations rise and fall as the photosynthetic changes took place. It's consonant with my own work, which sits at the intersection of art and science. I was trained initially to be a geologist and flamed out in higher mathematics, switched to art history, which was a long-term love, and landscape painting for me is geology without the math. So with that in mind, my project on Alexander von Humboldt was kind of a personal capstone, bringing together one of the questions that had been bedeviling me for most of my career, which is, how on earth did the United States become a culture obsessed with nature? Almost every other culture benchmarks itself based on what it builds and what it thinks, what it writes, and what it publishes. And we ended up creating the national park system instead. And it turns out that Alexander von Humboldt had a hand in that. And I went down the rabbit hole, as it will, and put together the exhibition that is also my PowerPoint backdrop, which is the introductory gallery of that exhibition, Alexander von Humboldt and the United States, Art, Nature, and Culture. Our first job was explaining to 91% of the people who walked through the door who had no idea who Humboldt was, who was Alexander von Humboldt. And as a man of statistics, it seemed only logical to point out that he traveled over 40,000 miles through 40 countries on 4 continents at a time when most people rarely left their hometown, wrote 36 books and over 25,000 letters to correspondents around the globe, discovered the location of the magnetic equator, mapped climate zones, and believed that all of nature was one interconnected ecosystem, slept only 4 hours a night, and called coffee concentrated sunbeams. He hated monarchy and everything that it stood for. He and Napoleon were born the same year, became fierce enemies their entire lives. And really that sets the tone then for why Humboldt spends 6 weeks in the United States, because he admires the ideals of American democracy, becomes BFFs with Thomas Jefferson. They become lifelong correspondents. And he's a little bit ticked off that he misses Lewis and Clark by a matter of weeks in 1804 when he arrives in Washington, D.C., but he believes, as this quote states, that what we would find in the interior of the country, the information, the data, the ability to map nature, would be what would put the United States on the global map. He also believed in local knowledge. He was the man who fought hard to have Europeans understand that pre-Columbian civilizations were not backwards, that they had been once sophisticated, high-level civilizations brought low by colonialism and imperial rule from outside. He fought against slavery, extolling the revolutions in Haiti, in Cuba, and hoping against hope that the United States would also abolish slavery during his lifetime, and influenced people like Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir to think about setting aside large swaths of the American continent as what he called natural monuments. John Muir was a little bit of a geek. Turns out Roosevelt was too. And as it should not come as no surprise, Humboldt would have his fingerprints all over the founding of the Smithsonian Institution with its motto for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. So why does Humboldt still matter? That's what really brings me here today, because what Humboldt was looking for in 50 plus years of exploration around the globe, mapping, measuring, writing, synthesizing, was a holistic understanding of the interconnectedness of everything. When he left for South America in 1799, he wrote to a friend of his and he said, "I shall collect plants and fossils, and with the best of instruments make astronomical observations. Yet this is not the main purpose of my journey. I shall endeavor to find out how nature's forces act upon one another, and in what manner the geographic environment exerts its influence on animals and plants. In short, I must find out about the harmony of nature." So Humboldt gathered perhaps the most sophisticated armature in scientific history. He took 42 instruments, each in a velvet-lined box, each one the most advanced and portable of its time, in order to take the kinds of measurements that were going to allow him to collect geographic measurements, physical properties, and actual specimens. So let's take a romp through a couple of those things, shall we? Humboldt in this portrait is shown in his happy place. He is there with his favorite barometer and altimeter down behind his back. You can see a version of that right there. He is sitting with his travel journals with pressed plants in between the leaves and a melastoma on the front there, which is important because he will write an entire book about this particular flower. So that this is a man who is literally trying to give you in this symbolic portrait a sense of what makes him tick. But in addition to collecting measurements and specimens, Humboldt collected ideas, and for that he looked to the locals. He horrified the Spanish noblemen in Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, and Peru, where he traveled across the Andes by ignoring most of the functionaries and going straight to the local indigenous communities in order to learn about their agriculture, their histories, their cosmologies, relying on them for the cultural wisdom that would underpin all of his queries. So querying people is also one of his techniques. He took that synthesis of science and art and started to scribble when he began to realize that the plants at the base of the Andes reminded him of the plants at the base of the Alps, and he wondered if they were the same plants he would find at the base of the Rockies in North America. And as he ascended Chimborazo and kept a diary of everything he saw, he began to understand that there were similarities in the shifts from grasses to alpine flowers to mosses. And he began to map what we think of as the biomes from the equatorial regions up to the Arctic, only he went vertically up Chimborazo. This little sketch, he begins to correlate, well, Mont Blanc is this high and Vesuvius is this high, but Chimborazo is up here. He is beginning to quantify and also to put together the pieces around the globe. And that will culminate in what he calls his plant geography map. It is literally the first infographic. It's actually based on British tax charts, where the idea was to give you a picture in order to get you invested, in this case, in 20 columns of data, flanking on either side of this. And we're going to come back to this particular infographic because this is what makes Humboldt's synthesis, that unity of nature, visible. This is his first effort to essentially give you a circumglobal sense of how the atmosphere, the climate, the plants, and the animals are distributed around the globe. So one of his favorite instruments was actually a 3-foot-long achromatic telescope, which he used to determine Greenwich Mean Time wherever he was by observing celestial phenomenon, looking at eclipses, the transit of Mercury, and comparing the times to those published in tabulated timetables. He then used a chronometer in order to establish longitude based on, again, Greenwich Mean Time. And what you see here is his chronometric measurements in his nearly indecipherable handwriting. He would then use what he called a snuff box sextant on the left, which actually could fit in his pocket, and a boxed sextant on the right, in order to establish longitude using lunar position and angles, and latitude by measuring the sun's angle over the horizon. He actually then took these and figured out how high a condor was flying by taking the average wingspan of a condor, looking at the angle of the wing, and establishing the height of the bird. In this detail of the painting that I showed you earlier, Humboldt is sharing that knowledge. He has the sextant out of its box. He is working with one of the locals as Aimé Bonpland. His botanist is sitting there with a dead condor, as it turns out, and his instruments, and they are beginning to again extrapolate and share the knowledge that Humboldt believed belonged to all people. In fact, interesting note, he owed the King of Spain a complete catalog of everything that he discovered in 4 years traveling through the colonies of New Spain, but he also then left it there for the locals to use and allowed Jefferson and the United States to make use of it, figuring it really shouldn't belong to any one person. With a magnetic dip, he ended up being able to locate the magnetic equator, which caused geographers to have to actually redraw most of their maps. It turns out Lima was 3 degrees off. So places started shifting around the globe as he began to be able to tighten up what he was able to provide in terms of accurate information. His favorite instrument was the barometer. He carried it everywhere he went. He used to exclaim to friends that his instruments were alive, and he talked about them as though they were his traveling companions. He used a hygrometer to measure humidity, a Leyden jar to collect electrical charges, which were used to determine the level of oxygen in the air at the equator and all the way up Chimborazo. And again, you've got his system of pre-sticky notes, sticky notes, sticking together all of his information about those electrostatic charges. And finally, he used a theodolite to establish the distance around landmarks. It's a tool that you'll often see surveyors use. In fact, today, when they are measuring the streets, they'll use a theodolite. One of my favorite paintings of Humboldt and Bonpland is this one. It's this fabulous sort of romantic notion of two guys out in the woods. They're indoors, they're outdoors, they have science, they have art. It's a mess. It's the intellect, it's the emotion, it's that whole sort of shooting match across the edges there. And I think what's really important is that Humboldt spends his life trying to bring art and science, emotion and reason, measure and hypothesis into a kind of parallel. Those plants that he collected, you see them sticking out in between the pages of his travel journal. This is what some of those plants actually looked like after they were pressed in the field and brought home. They then get translated into these elaborate, gorgeous, aesthetically driven, but botanically accurate publications that will end up ruining him financially because they are so bloody expensive. But in images like this that show up in his physical atlas, where you've got the beginning of his ascent of Chimborazo, there is also this emphasis on the blue of the sky and the beauty of the landscape. One of the reasons Frederick Church, the American landscape painter, liked Humboldt so much and read him deeply was Humboldt spent an entire third of his book Cosmos giving advice to landscape painters. And one thing rings out: an artist must have the eye of a scientist and know what it is that he paints. And a scientist must never lose the sense of aesthetic wonder of staring up at the blue sky. That blue sky will become kind of important. And oh, by the way, there's Humboldt in the middle yanking up a plant while all of the porters are about to carry those 42 instruments up to the top of Chimborazo, which was then believed to be the tallest mountain in the world. And I will say that Humboldt in 1803, without oxygen, REI, or any other supplemental things, managed to hold a climbing record of 19,300 feet, which is a record that lasted 30 years. Not exactly a slouch there either. But those categories of measuring, of observing, it's half art, it's half science, comparing data from around the globe, extrapolating data from the equator to the poles. But he took along with him one purely aesthetically driven instrument, and that's his cyanometer. And this, I've marked in blue the aspect of the color blue as expressed by the cyanometer. And then you'll notice down here, I don't know whether you can read it, he's measuring the intensity of the sky. So literally, he is holding this up in order to determine how blue the sky is as he ascends Chimborazo, because as we all know, as you go up in altitude, the oxygen level changes, and so does your perception of the atmosphere. So this is how a cyanometer works. And if you actually want one of your own, you can make a donation to the Barry Lopez Foundation, and they will send you one of these so that you can determine the color of blue on my shirt or hold it up and the color of the sky. And it is marked very much the way this one is here. That purely subjective sentiment was something that Humboldt delighted in. This was created by Saussure, one of the leading scientists in Paris. And I think a reminder that science and art really have always been good buddies up until sort of the more recent period where we have tended to view them at opposite ends of the same spectrum. So who cares? Well, Humboldt's plant geography map is still in use. And in fact, what we have learned is that because of climate change, vegetation is slowly moving up the mountain as glaciation recedes. It is a bellwether for scientists, but it is also a benchmark from which we can understand actual change over the last hundreds of years. But I'd like to sort of end with a story about Humboldt and climate change and planetary stewardship. This is an image of Lake Valencia in modern-day Venezuela. And when Humboldt arrived there in 1799, he was chatting with the locals, and they mentioned that the level of the lake was dropping, that there was a great deal of erosion. They couldn't grow crops the way they used to, and they were deeply puzzled, and they wondered if Humboldt, with all of his instruments, might be able to shed some light on this. Humboldt instead went to the village elders, and he talked with them about their history and their agricultural practices. And his conclusion was, 25 years earlier, they had cut down most of the mature trees surrounding the lake, and in so doing, had affected a local change in their climate. In 1799, Humboldt was connecting human activity to localized climate change. It is something that will be a bellwether for the entirety of his life. He lives until 1859. He has a tremendous influence on those sciences, such that in 1819, he publishes what he calls isotherms and isobars. He literally wraps the globe with lines that represent 10-degree intervals in mean temperature. So if you can see this on the left-hand side in America, it's Labrador, Boston, Philadelphia, the Carolinas, Florida, and Havana, compared in the middle to Stockholm, Budapest, Naples, and Africa, and to China on the far right. They are, pragmatically, the reason that we have the Weather Channel. All of those squiggly lines are isotherms and isobars, and they are designed to give you temperature gradients, just as you would get topographical gradients on a topo map. In the United States, the reason we have FDA growing zones is that Humboldt's isothermal chart that you see here was used to determine what you can grow where and when. And then Lauren Blodgett, a Smithsonian climate scientist, will use a similar take in order to measure annual rainfall. In short, although Humboldt lived long before the computer age and probably would have been thrilled to pieces in order to have access to the entire store of the world's knowledge on a cell phone, he did write, "The climate of the continents is dependent on the changes which humans call forth on the surface of the land masses by the procreation of huge masses of steam and gas in the centers of industry." He argued for planetary stewardship. He argued for individual and collective awareness. And I see a synergy between his work and Jenny's work in terms of understanding the sheer beauty and artistry found in nature, but the responsibility that goes along with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Dan, can you take over the slides?
Yeah, let me do my screen share here. Hold on one second here.
That was great, Eleanor. Thanks.
One minute here. Eleanor, you must know this, but the Huntington has Fred Church's painting of Chimborazo in the art division here.
They do, but they also have a firm no loan policy. Otherwise,
That's been, yeah, I know. They're like another country from the library, so I take no responsibility whatsoever. But it's certainly one of our treasures, you know, and it gets a lot of traffic. And
as well, it should.
We did just loan Blue Boy to the National Gallery in London for its centennial. So I don't think I've had enough of concentrated sunbeams today, as Humboldt would say, but it's earlier in the day here. But so I want to talk a little bit about something that's allied to Eleanor's talk and to Jenny's as well, and it really is about, in a way, quantification. If you think about things that way, and about the quantification of color. And so if you think about what quantifying things does for the world and for a wider world, it serves a number of different purposes. So it provides authority. It provides a point of comparison, because when you quantify things, that necessarily involves one thing among a number of other things, right? And third, it provides a common sort of vocabulary. And colored dictionaryists, let's call them that, people that worked on colored dictionaries, were able to work because they mediated a sensor, our eyes, and also our ways to describe that sensory input. And so we know that we all see color differently. The red that you see is a red that you understand and you can work comparatively with. The red that I see might be slightly different than the red you see, even though we're looking at the same thing. And so to have some ways to quantify that in a visual form that we can agree upon is essential when it comes to trying to make sense of not just the natural world, but for all the other things that we use color for as well, because we use color for many other things. And if you look at something like the Mansell color system or the Pantone system or any number of the other sort of color systems that have been created, they're used for many other things besides the natural world. But in some ways, these originate in the natural world. So what I want to talk about, I think I'm going to change my screensaver. Give me 1 second here. To my homeland here. A little less distracting. Maybe it's more distracting. So color dictionaries come along, and so names are squishy, right? Common names are squishy, and they're the reason that scientists prefer the Latinate binomial names for things, because there's a precision that's international. So when you're talking about a particular creature, the common name might float around and it will certainly be different in different languages, but the binomial name will remain the same. All of that, of course, is also not necessarily true because those change for a number of different biological reasons over time. But so names are squishy, but if you're going to name a color, you can, if you're going to tag the visual of a color with something, you're going to either give it a name or you're going to give it a number. You're going to give it some sort of a marker that delineates it so that you can have a, really what you're after is a common vocabulary. So if you're a naturalist and you're working in, I don't know, at the base of Chimborazo, and you find a plant that's a particular color, and because plants don't really obey geopolitical boundaries, you might find that same genus or species of plant somewhere else. Say a naturalist in Kansas has got a cognate plant he wants to ask about. And so rather than saying, Chimborazo biologist, I found a plant and I want to talk to you about it. And I want to tell you its color because color is very important in species identification. It's a really, really light blue. Well, that doesn't get you very far down the road when it comes to trying to understand what it is and where it fits. And so I want to take you through a little spin through some of these color dictionaries. And one of the earliest, and certainly one of the most famous, was the one that Abraham Werner created in the late 18th century, and finally was turned into a more usable form in the 19th century in the form of this Werner's nomenclature of colors. The Huntington has a copy of it. Our copy has been digitized, and you can get it, the whole setup, on the Darwin online, because Darwin is known to have taken not our copy, but a copy of this book on the voyage of the Beagle. And so Darwin, learning many new things for science in the course of understanding that organisms change over time and they turn into species, starts developing the groundwork for his theory of evolution. And Werner's nomenclature of colors is one of his essential tools. So the first thing that naturalists start to do when they're talking about color is they talk comparatively about it. So I'll read these to you. I'm not sure how visible these are. I've got a close up. So he's taken the colors and he's created categories for animal, mineral, and vegetable. As you can see here, animal, vegetable, and mineral. And if you look up close, you can see tile red is the breast of the cock bullfinch. The vegetable is shrubby pimpernel, and the mineral is porcelain jasper. This assumes, of course, you know what these, that you're a naturalist with a common understanding of these, of what these look like. That you're in an area where, for instance, apples do grow, or that you're near the ocean, so you know what a curlew looks like, for instance. And so there are different sort of prejudices. There are many aspects to these color dictionaries as quantifiers, but one of them is certainly that you have to know something about the region in which the color is being discussed. And so that becomes really important. People then tend to use colors in lots of other ways. And so this is a book called The American Dyer, and these are fabric dyeing samples, and they include recipes for colors and shades, several hundred of them, along with about 100 samples of these colored wool and cotton waste. And they're aniline dyes. This has become a very rare book, but they pasted in a colored piece of wool into each of the spots to delineate the color, because you might have a list of colors, but does you no good without the color itself. And it's really shocking to me how many times early printed books never bothered with illustrations. And there are reasons for this. They were expensive. There were other difficulties in creating color because of the fact that you had to hand color things before color printing came along and so on. But it's really shocking that books like Werner's really started off as just textual descriptions of color rather than actually showing the colors. And so by the dawn of the time that the second half of the 19th century rolls around, people start illustrating things in color. And this is a book called The Practical Ostrich Feather Dyer. And they've used the same thing. They've actually pasted these feathers, these dyed feathers into the book. And our conservation department had to put these all back because they keep springing out of the book. We had to have them sort of fitted to the page. So they've attached the names. So seal brown, crushed strawberry, orange, Bismarck brown. And people found those fanciful. And many people wanted to develop these color dictionaries, but key among them were scientists who found it potentially of great use. And so the person who probably had the biggest impact was Robert Ridgeway, who was the Smithsonian's first curator of birds. I wrote a book about Ridgeway called The Feathery Tribe, and I've got a chapter on these color dictionaries, which is what wrapped up my interest in the topic. But in the course of it, he's made a decision about how to pick names for these books. And he says, you don't really want to have squishy, nonsensical colors like crushed elephant, whatever that would look like. Or, he lists off some sort of fanciful names. And then he turns around and, dragon's breath red. He finds those things silly. But then in a turn, he starts using those kinds of colors himself. So he publishes one of these color dictionaries in 1886. At the very same time, he's working on one of the world's great ornithological nomenclatures, the birds of North and Middle America, as it's called. And you can see he's named up some of these colors: claret brown, maroon, madder brown, liver brown, and so on, hand-painted swatches. I'm accelerating my bit about Ridgeway a little bit. Between Ridgeway's 1886 book and his next book in 1912, a wonderful obscure book is called about a color dictionary is published, a repertoire of colors for aiding in determining the colors of flowers, leaves, and fruit. And it was published by the French Society of Chrysanthemists. And it's an intensely nationalistic book. And it does the same thing. It has a color, has a description, the ordinary color of choice cigars he has for Havana Brown. He's got a wonderful blue. He says the color of the sky in springtime in Paris is his descriptor for the color. Another one, it's the color of the blood of a freshly killed rabbit. So these things all assume you have some access to or knowledge of the things that produce these colors. So Ridgeway's particular maneuver was to separate these things out from lived experience and simply provide a name. That said, the names were extremely evocative. And so, and many of them they're evocative in the sense that they reference a deep art history. So there's references to people throughout art. They used color painters, people that did painterly things, people that had involvement with color matters during Ridgeway's lifetime. So there's a color named Bradley's Blue in his dictionary. These are the typical, it's a very extreme close-up of this. The Smithsonian has all the original, Ridgeway's original swaths and drafts of this book in the archives there, and they're really quite fascinating to look at. And he uses these, so Bradley's Blue is named after Milton Bradley, who was, before he was so you might know Milton Bradley from the board games that he produced. Well, before he was a board game guy, he was a color guy. And so he made sort of claims that he had homage to any number of people involved in the color landscape. And so and you can see what these look like. They were used for everything from identifying rocks and plants to stamp collectors whose values of stamps often hinge on very fine distinctions of color. A very rare stamp, very common stamp might be a very particular shade of red. and a certain denomination. The very, very rare version of that might be very slightly different in color, but the same denomination. So people would send their stamps to the Smithsonian often and say, could you use Ridgway's dictionary? Long after his death, they'd say, could you use his dictionary and see if this is actually the valuable stamp? I think it isn't. They were very obliging about it. But Ridgway's particular turn also was to use these terms in his ornithological work. And so venacious drab, and same with every color you see in this page here is one of his colors in his dictionary: purple drab, venacious drab, and so on. So he puts them into play in the course of talking about birds. So he's got 1,115 named colors in this color dictionary. And it made him somewhat crazy. Here's a drawing he took out of a book, and he wrote at the bottom, R.R. Robert Ridgway after a day's work with a color wheel. He wrote to a friend, he said, I have a notion this morning to put the whole business in the furnace. He wrote to a friend in 1907. The thing has so nearly driven me crazy that I haven't enough gray matter left to last me to the end. He's trying to match old color nomenclatures to modern ones. And here's a shot of Ridgway himself. One of my theses is that Ridgway suffered from arsenic poisoning, because you can see how blackened his fingers are. It's a little hard to see here, but they used arsenic to prepare the study skins that they used to create the specimens. Have any of you ever heard of Emperor blue? It's a color. It's a Pantone color. It's if you Google it, you'll get several tens of thousands of hits. It's a car color. Ford has a car color named Emperor blue, but there's not a person on the planet that knows or knew what Emperor blue was. And so it shows it for the very first time in Ridgway's dictionary in 1912. And so I finally figured it out. So Ridgway's son Audubon dies as a young man in the early 20th century, and he and his wife retreat to Costa Rica to spend time with their friend Jose Zeledon, who's the director of the Natural History Museum in Costa Rica. And they spend 6 months down there, and Jose Zeledon's wife is named Amparo. And I'm absolutely certain that's who he named this color for. And it's ubiquitous. And as I said, you can get you can find a lot of matches. So people think about color in ways that are somewhat unexpected. But what they do with these names, these color names, is they attach them to other sensibilities. And so I think if you think about us as the biggest sensor of all, you know, we play an essential role in making sense of color through our sensors, and then we take our sensors and we use those colors meaningfully by attaching names and being able to talk comparatively about them to wider audiences. And that really ends up being the function of dictionaries like this. They're a way to reflect back to the world, as it were, what these colors are, and to be able to have a common vocabulary for understanding them. And, you know, color names are endlessly fascinating and resonant for a lot of different reasons, in the same way that, of course, the colors themselves are resonant. And I think I'm probably past time now, so I probably should stop. So thank you very much.
All right. So I see no questions from the online people. No. Okay. So are there any questions in this room for either of our two speakers? And I will repeat them back.
The color charts that were recently on the screen had white at the top and black at the bottom for all the colors. Why would they do that?
Okay. Dan, the question is, on some of the color charts that you showed, there was white on the top and black at the bottom for those images. What is the?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a white
Why would
swatch
they
at the very
repeat that?
top and bottom of each page. Those are just meant to be indicator colors, so that the user has a visual comparison of the I guess the chromatic difference between white or black and the color in question. And you know, the other thing is, well, I guess that's probably the most useful. I don't want to go into a long color theory explanation, but I think they were intended as reference colors, just simply so you could make sense of the color. If you're in very bright sunlight, for instance, or in a very dark room, you could have a white or a black swatch, would really give you a kind of a visual color correction, I suppose. So if the really light color looked dark and dim light, you could, I think the idea is anyway, you could make sort of a visual adjustment for what the color really looked like, because that's the other thing about these color dictionaries, is you have no control over the lighting in which people are going to use them. And so Ridgeway wanted to account for the fact that they might be used in any number of different lighting circumstances. It's not always a given that you'd be in direct sunlight or indirect sunlight, or even you might be under artificial light by the teens. They had artificial lighting. And so it's meant to account, I think, for a variety of lighting circumstances.
Has anyone turned the pigment color into a wavelength color?
Oh gosh. There's you should read my book. There was a whole push at the Smithsonian to do exactly that. And there's a really funny quote by the secretary of the Smithsonian at the time. He said, Mr. Ridgeway said, if you use the solar spectra as the markers for your colors, you'd be immortal essentially, because those are going to stand the test of time, and your names might not stand the test of time. And so so in terms of identifying the colors through spectra, through a numeric descriptor, that was tried. But Ridgeway was no physicist. He was an artist, and he was a scientist albeit with an 8th grade education, as a man who came from rural Indiana and rural Illinois. And so physics flummoxed him, and he was game about it. He tried to take a sort of a physics turn and a spectral turn towards using those tools to describe or indicate color. And then he just said, I'm not going to do it. And they said, okay.
Same question, but with hexadecimal codes.
Okay, what about hexadecimal codes and wavelengths?
They did talk very briefly about that. I don't think anyone's gone back to try to render them currently into hexadecimal codes recently. Be a good project, but no one's ever tried to do that I'm aware of. And I can see, you can see the kind of quantification utility for things like that, because again, that gets you really much more accurate rendering. And you can see the limitations in Ridgeway's color descriptions and their place in precision, because he'll say, I showed it, one of the texts in his book, it says nearly sorghum green. So between 1,100 colors is nowhere near enough colors to satisfy every color that is out there, of course, for the millions of colors that we have that we can detect with the naked eye. And so he just he turned to having to say it's between this color and this color, kind of, which is not very precise. So.
And I will just say that I think the astrobiology context is exclusively all sort of wavelength based analysis, right? That's the indicator information that we're getting from outer space. We're not seeing it, but that our sensors are seeing that.
Yeah. Like the color indicators on the Mars rover, for instance,
Right. So Katayun online has asked, Corey Hayden has a book about when nature goes public and critiques the loss of context and narrative for chemically active ingredients that are derived from indigenous medicine, ethnopharma. The plant name exchanged for a number in the high throughput screening. What do you think about the change from names that have the narrative context to more standardized color naming?
I'm not certain I understand the question, but I take Katayun, I take you to mean that, to ask what would it look like if we were to replace these color names with numbers. Is that correct?
I would interpret it that way too.
Okay.
And the loss that happens.
Yeah. So this is the risk of standardization, is you immediately lose cultural context for it. In fact, the fact that if you're using an English name, you're going to have a whole different valence to the name, different resonance than you'd have if you had the indigenous name for it, or just another non-English name for it. Certainly, you lose that. And in fact, there's no reason that these names in most Western languages, color names tend to be 1 or 2 words, but in other cultural contexts, they're many words long. It might the description, and this is how scientific names work before Linnaeus. That the description of the name is baked into the name. So it might be the rose. So for Linnaeus, it would say a plant would be called the rose with red thorns on every branch would be the name of the plant. That'd be the scientific name in Latin. And so in a rough cognate, that's what a lot of these cultural names from other cultures do as well. They use the descriptor as the common name for the plant. And so you do lose that. And what we really need is a giant pharmacology where people have put together an enormous sort of canvassing of all the ways that people have talked about a color. And you'd have to do a lot of deep research into cultural uses of the colors. It's an interesting problem. There's a lot still to be said and written about that particular topic, but you'd certainly lose the indigenous context. I think that's absolutely true.
So I have a question for Eleanor. We have a blog post here at Cornell about our copy of Alexander von Humboldt's book. And it says in the blog post here that in the English translation of that book that has his map of all the ecological species, in the English translation, they removed his critique of slavery in the United States in the English translation. Do you know anything about that?
I do. When Humboldt wrote his essay on the island of Cuba in the 1820s, Humboldt wrote 36 books. One of them happened to be an essay on the island of Cuba in which he discusses its history. At that point, it is the largest trading partner that the United States has. That Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico economy is extremely important to the US, and Cuba is the single largest trading partner at that point. So Humboldt discusses its economics, its cultural history, and there is an entire chapter in which he takes apart the premise of race-based slavery. He basically says the color of a man's skin has absolutely no bearing on his intelligence or his capabilities. That is a matter of socioeconomics and vagaries of fate, that if you swapped people, that you would have absolutely no difference in the outcome. When he publishes it, it is published in French and in Spanish, but not originally in English. And a very unhelpful person, a pro-slavery advocate from North Carolina named Jesse Thrasher, decides to do Humboldt the favor of translating it into English. And he does so by leaving out that chapter on excoriating slavery. And then he has the temerity to write to Humboldt and say, I think I improved on your work. Humboldt reacts viscerally. He is livid. He says, basically, you have freedom of speech and you are censoring me. It's like, this is beyond the pale. This is totally unacceptable. That back and forth between Thrasher and Humboldt gets so much press, and Humboldt has it published in newspapers in Germany, in France, and in the United States. More people end up reading the essay on the island of Cuba because of that back and forth and Humboldt's just, white hot fury about this, because this is an issue that really matters to him. He is walking the walk and talking the talk. And in fact, at the time that Thrasher the translation doesn't come out until the 1850s. I think it's 56. Humboldt will actually support John C. Fremont's bid for the presidency against James Buchanan because Fremont is running on a Humboldt-inspired abolitionist platform.
All right.
So, literally, this is a lifelong project for Humboldt, and I don't think he is angrier about anything in his public life than he is about Thrasher's deliberately censoring that translation.
Well, it's such a mixed bag with translation in the 19th century too, because you get people that then you get wider exposure to your works, although they're really wrong-headed exposure. And it's like to mix my metaphors, it's like the Wild West of, copyright is not come to. So Clemence Royer translates Darwin's Origin of Species into French a couple years after it's published, and she adds this long anti-Catholic screed for like 60 pages, and he's furious. And then a guy named Braun translates the German version of The Origin of Species into German. And Darwin's really unhappy, and then Darwin has him do the second edition as well. And so, nothing sells like nothing. It's a mixed bag because you get broader exposure, but your ideas are also sort of transmogrified into
Yeah.
weird, unexpected, and often undesirable forms, right? You know?
I think that's absolutely right. And you're right about sort of the Wild West on copyright. There are any number of publications that are just completely Baudelarized by, being sort of
Yeah.
serialized, and the translations are bungled. And Humboldt's really careful about his translations. And I will say this too, all three of Humboldt's translators, Elise Ate, Elizabeth Sabine, and Helen Maria Williams, they are all scientifically inclined women who translate from multiple languages. He deliberately looks to people that he thinks have a sensibility for his work. And these are all women who would like to be members of scientific societies and can't because of their gender. They can coattail if their spouse or their father is a member, but that's the only way they get to attend a meeting. And so the entire Parisian salon system is literate, intelligent women looking for a way to take those discussions from the halls of science into their living rooms and continue the conversation there. And Humboldt is a fixture at all of those. And that's where he meets Maria Helena Williams, who encourages him to read from his unpublished notes and then offers to be his translator.
That's fascinating. So so it sounds like people solicit from him to be their translators, and maybe at other times he reaches out to people to
I think in this case, with Elizabeth Sabine, her husband is an eminent British scientist, and Humboldt clearly doesn't have much use for him, but he really likes his wife. And Humboldt is almost certainly gay. I think that's pretty much pro forma. So it's not like he's making a move on these women. I think he genuinely believes that brains come in all kinds of bizarre packaging and that the packaging shouldn't matter.
Well said.
When he does his lectures for Cosmos in Berlin, he does it, he changes venues because he needs a venue which will allow women to go there. And 1/3 of his audience is reliably women who are there to learn. So, I mean, he goes to great lengths to make sure that his speaking opportunities are as egalitarian as possible. He can't change the rules of the scientific societies, but he can make the rules around where he speaks.
That's really
No, he's a really interesting character for a very 19th century guy locked into a lot of, the problems of the 19th century. One of the things I admire about him is that he really believes that every one of society's rules is meant to be broken if it holds you back from true knowledge and understanding. And that is gender-based, it is class-based. He really does believe that it should all be out there for everybody.
So I have 2 closing remarks. This book, Microbiology du Soul, is Winogradski's book from the late 1800s, and it's hard for you to see afar, but these are his color tables of micropigment colors. So it's another pigment category for you, Dan. So here's my question for you, Dan. What color is Eleanor's shirt?
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. That's very well. It's very close to Emperor Blue. I've got to say.
It is actually.
And
I don't know
Eleanor,
I don't know what color Arctic Cool calls it. I'm not 100%. I was actually holding up the cyanometer trying to figure
That's
it out.
hilarious.
okay, so then Eleanor, what altitude is Dan's shirt?
Oh, hang on just a second. Let me pull this thing back out.
Altitude.
We can do this.
Genius.
All right. Okay. Dan's shirt is.
Dan, why don't you talk?
It's chromatically a little different, and that's part of the problem with monitors, because what you see on the monitor is different than what you would see in daylight, and that's part of the problem here. But I'm thinking Dan is about an 18 on a scale of 30, which should put him at about 4,000 feet.
I hope you all understand why I
I'm at a
love
high
these 2
altitude lake.
people.
Yeah, I'm at a high altitude lake in the tropics.
Exactly. So yeah.
That's really great. We have one of those. We've got
We did not plan this.
That's so funny. My shirt is almost Emperor Blue, but it's lighter. But fully 10% of Ridgeway's 1,100 colors are blue, which is really quite something.
The best color in the world.
It really is. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone who's joined us today, and especially let's give a warm round of applause for Dan and Eleanor. Thank you so much for joining us, and that concludes our session.
Super fun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
It was a
all.
pleasure to be here.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much.